Thank you, Janet. Yeah, it's your kind words about the book. It's sold almost no copies, I think. It's not literally no copies, but uh, so the content may indeed be wonderful. The problem is the price. So it probably tells us a lesson about economics, that however good something is, people aren't prepared to pay. Um, but I sort of felt it took me many years to write, and at that stage, frankly, once it was in print, I rather thought that was that. I'd done everything I possibly needed to do. Anyway, so thank you for the invitation. It's great to be able to talk to you and to be able to do so just by walking into my study and sitting on the desk and not having to go any further. So that's great too. Well, I want to talk about something that I've probably been banging on about really ever since Brexit. So Brexit sets us thinking about how we structure our support for rural land management. And clearly, in principle, gives us a blank sheet to start again to think through first principles. And having spent, most of us having spent 40 years criticizing the Common Agricultural Policy, then I guess we really have no excuse for not thinking of something more interesting to do. So what I have in mind is to think about local environmental government. So think about devolving at least a proportion of responsibility for rural environmental land management to a more local scale. And we've done some thinking about it before. I spent some time with Janet thinking about that, and I'll touch on that at a point later on in this presentation. But what I want to focus on is a question about whether Natural Cambridgeshire is a potential local environmental governance organisation. As far as I'm aware, really, there's nothing particularly special about Natural Cambridgeshire, or indeed Cambridgeshire. Well, clearly has distinctive characteristics, as everywhere does. But I want to think about it as sort of a principle rather than think of it as a particularly special case. So what I'll do is touch briefly on the challenge for countryside recovery. Seems we have to talk about recovery nowadays rather than regeneration or anything else. I'll then briefly think about a model of collaborative local governance, think about a couple of ways in which we might do that, a national park approach and a local nature partnership approach, and then talk a little bit about Natural Cambridgeshire, look at what it's doing, and then perhaps to reflect on what it is doing and what it might do more or differently if it was a local environmental governance organisation in the sense that I'm talking about that. And then briefly, I'll think about the national requirements that would need to be put in place to provide what I have in mind is a system of Legos and potentially a system of local nature partnerships taking on the role as Legos. So this, I think, is sort of fairly obvious that we are experiencing significant changes in the nature of demand for rural land, that we are recognizing a whole range of values, many of which we've recognized before, but are coming increasingly important. So food obviously still remains there, but biodiversity, recognizing the biodiversity crisis, the loss of biodiversity, we seem to have shifted. We used to think about England as the green and pleasant land with wonderful landscapes and rural environments. We now seem to have concluded that it is the most damaged and devastated rural environment almost anywhere in the world, I think. I guess the honest truth is somewhere in between, but also thinking about greenhouse gas emissions from activities on rural land, the potential for using rural land for carbon sequestration, flood mitigation, public access, public health. Increasingly, we can't talk about rural recreation now without referring to public health and well-being, and landscape aesthetics, which we almost don't talk about at all nowadays, but we used to focus on entirely, or to a large extent anyway. So we're thinking about how all these different sorts of values might be brought together in particular places. And the focus here is continuing, I suppose, a shift away from thinking about sector by sector, thinking about rural activities by sector, to thinking about rural activities and rural environment by places. And of course, the key issue with many of these different sorts of values is their public good characteristics. But not only do they have public good characteristics, there are also conflicts and synergies amongst them. And I think perhaps particularly the synergies are important. So when you provide often flood mitigation, I guess you guys probably have got some beavers near you. I don't think we've got any beavers near us here. But thinking about flood mitigation probably creates carbon sequestration, creates biodiversity, creates opportunities for public access. These things are going together, and no one particular individual or organization probably wants to pay for all of those things. So there are synergies and obviously conflicts as well in certain cases, public access being in conflict with certain sorts of conservation uses, for instance. There is then spatial variability, and I think that's one of the logics of saying, well, we need to think more about places and how those places differ, and therefore thinking about how we provide governance for those places that is distinctive in particular ways to reflect the local environment. And then, of course, multiple stakeholders with different sorts of interests, landowners, farmers, visitors, utility companies, and all sorts of other organizations that have an interest of one sort or another in what rural land does. And that leads me to the idea of, if you like, a governance gap of some sort, that our government still substantially is operated by sectors rather than by places. So DEFRA with responsibility, I guess, across the board for rural policy, trade, Natural England, Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, Ofwat, planning, local authorities, all with different sorts of interests, but not very well joined up with each other. I think there's a limit to centralized government. Much of what we've done in terms of agri-environment policy to date has been, to a large extent, central government with advice and with some local consultation, but primarily through the centre, designing agri-environment mechanisms, schemes, and then basically offering them to people who want to supply them. So it's very centralized and supply side oriented. And another element I think that we lack is institutions to represent demand. So it's not quite clear at the moment where demand comes from. It tends to come, I suspect, substantially from nature conservation organizations, NGOs, who are very effective, successful, well-informed in trying to influence government policy in particular ways. But also, as a sort of following on from that, it seems to me there are two separate approaches, and certainly, I guess in what I've done, I've tended to focus on central government, particularly on agri-environment schemes. So we thought about designations, national designations, SSSI, national nature reserves, and so on. We thought about agri-environment, sort of now merging, turning into the environmental land management schemes. We thought about regulation, but it seems not very often enforced. But all of this directed and funded by central government on a voluntary basis. So take up, as I say, with some local guidance, but substantially driven from the centre. But alongside that, and actually sort of looking at Cambridgeshire, as this has struck me, and as I say, I don't believe that Cambridge is different from anywhere else, but the enormous amount of initiative and emphasis going in the voluntary sector and in local government, so local authorities, local NGOs, wildlife trusts, national trust, and so on, all making a really significant effort and I think contribution at a local scale. And then I guess local authorities, local plans, looking for green infrastructure, and parishes, even local neighbourhood plans. Certainly we had a rather abortive effort in my village to produce a neighbourhood plan, which may be going on, but in a sense, one of the things that seemed to capture people's imagination and people seemed to want to talk about really was public access. and that enable us to sort of collect information about what the local community wanted, where it might be good to try and join up rights of way and so on, but at a very, very local scale. Clearly, that's not feasible in central government to think about things at that sort of minute scale. So there are these two separate approaches, but which don't really connect. It seems to me that the voluntary approaches are funded, and perhaps I'll talk a little bit about that, sort of by grants and one-off payments. Central government has much more systematic and substantial funding for the activities that it's directing. So that rather leads me to think more about collaborative local governance. I haven't worried too much about the collaborative bit of it, and perhaps I need to think more about that. But it seems to me we need local institutions that have the capacity to represent local demands, thereby to devolve decisions to some extent, at least, from central government to some sort of local decision-making body. But importantly, the capacity to directly influence land use decisions. So the key thing here, I think, is that it is often the landowners that know most about the land, their own land, and their opportunities to use land in different ways. And yet often the plans that are made at a local scale bear almost no influence on individuals' landholders' actions. So we need to think about a mechanism that has the capability of directly influencing, creating incentives for landowners to change their management approaches and land uses, and then to try and coordinate shared interests. So the series of aims and objectives that I think we need to try and pursue. If we've got local governance, then we have to have public acceptance for it. The local community has to respect the decisions that it's taking somehow, and that might mean some sort of direct democratic credibility, or it might just mean that it's respected in some other way. Clearly, the organization needs to have transparency and accountability, needs to have a long-term perspective. And I'm struck when you look at issues about carbon sequestration, looking about biodiversity restoration. These are very long-term projects, much longer term than we are used to in thinking about agri-environment schemes, or perhaps almost anything else, and certainly much longer term than the typical funding, which is perhaps on a 5-year, potentially longer than that, but not very often. So a relatively short-term perspective. And of course, the other aspect of this is that government tends to have a short-term perspective too. So, and then thinking about the functions that we're trying to, or if you like, the governance gap, the planning, coordination and facilitation, and some sort of procurement, i.e. perhaps we could say buying public goods from local environmental managers or local land managers. I don't know if you can see the top of that slide. I can't. I can't quite remember what it says. But this is a series of recommendations that came out of a natural capital strategy produced for North Devon. So North Devon was a pioneer area. And so they looked at the idea of trying to bring a lot of the governance elements together within the local area. I think it was substantially theoretical rather than actually getting to the practice of it and actually doing it in practice. But the idea of, and I won't talk through these in detail, but institutional responsibility, adaptive management, localization, and shared commitment seem to me 4 key elements of thinking about how we devolve governance in some way to local areas. So what I've been talking about is local environmental governance organizations, so LEGOs. Somebody did wonder whether I had a copyright issue over that, but nobody yet, I don't know that anybody yet has noticed. When I get people from Lego coming along and challenging me, I will know I've made some progress, I suppose. I don't think it's likely to happen. But what we need, sort of thinking about what a Lego might be, one way of, I think, capturing that is as a trustee for the local environment, or for the, perhaps I should say the local rural environment, over a long-term period. So we could think about an organization that has that long-term responsibility to think about what is best for the local environment, and I'm not quite sure whether to get drawn into ideas about optimality and optimization or sustainability, or maybe resilience. But those sorts of principles ought to inform trustees, providing some sort of guidance to the local environment in the long term. That needs to bring local stakeholders together and to represent their interests. So there's some question there about, well, what is the demand for local environmental change amongst the local community, for want of a better term, the local stakeholders, and how do we represent that demand and then use that to try and influence local land management decisions. This organisation needs to promote and coordinate actions, and as I say, it needs to create incentives. That implies it needs to have some sort of leverage over land management decisions. And I'm basically assuming that that's a funding incentive, but nevertheless, it's beyond that. I think that if this organisation has support, it needs to draw out, it needs to capture the goodwill amongst local landholders and to enable those who want to rewild or to farm in different ways to protect and enhance the environment, has to enable those sorts of actions as well as create incentives amongst those who are more reluctant. So it needs to be adaptive, and there's a challenge here that I perhaps haven't really thought through between the idea of adaptive management, where you say, well, okay, we need to learn, we need to find out what's going on, we need to monitor and then adjust our behavior and decisions to that on the one hand, but we're also saying we need to be able to fix things in a long-term way so that they are robust against external shocks and so on. And there is a tension there. That I guess perhaps every decision-making organisation is going to have to face. So what might this look like? Well, we could think about a Lego, and that Lego has some. It may undertake assessment of local natural capital, but it needs to clearly have good information about the local opportunities, maybe some sort of enterprise mapping, or there's another word that's gone at the moment, but also to be familiar with local priorities and local demands, but also, I guess, one way of national government influencing what goes on the ground will be for national government to try and create incentives for Legos to operate in particular ways. So a Lego may get grants from a national organisation as well as perhaps trying to raise funds at a local scale. And then to think about the Lego as being, and again, I'm not quite sure whether it's a brokerage or a clearinghouse, but some sort of marketplace. Maybe clearinghouse is better because I don't want it to be quite so narrowly market oriented, but an organisation that brings people together that share objectives and interests and potentially willingness to pay, brings them together to find opportunities, and through the Lego, or maybe facilitated by the Lego even rather than through the Lego, but to bring the funding from a national scale, national funding, ELM funding, Nature for Climate and so on, together with maybe local offsetting or a local nature investment fund of some sort, to bring that together along with private finance, which probably should be in there as well. So it will try and draw in private finance by engaging perhaps maybe with philanthropy, maybe with organizations simply wanting to do good things in their local environment, but maybe also people willing to, organizations willing to pay for offsetting of various sorts. And that would lead to environmental land management contracts if some element of environmental land management funding is devolved to Legos, but also supporting nature-based solutions and land-based projects. So the Lego would sit at the center of that sort of role. Then perhaps to some extent I've covered this, so needs some initial assessment of natural capital, building social capital, bringing organizations together in various ways, getting local actors to understand each other, to have confidence in each other, finding those potential funding sources, and assessing local priorities. Maybe this is through a local nature recovery strategy. So there seem to be several elements of policy sort of floating around at the moment that are not very well joined up. So part of this aim, I think, is to try and join up the bits and pieces of policy that appear in the Environment Act. And then a clearinghouse building its own local fund, maybe getting funding from central government, enabling local stakeholders to draw funds from different places, and then trying to put that together into packages that work in particular places. And then managing, if it's had its contracts, then managing its own contracts, monitoring, enforcing, making sure that they do deliver, and then publishing, making sure that the results are disseminated from that work. It seems to me there are two sort of models that we might develop from, and so I did some work with Janet, I guess quite a long while ago now, but I haven't moved on, even though Janet never has many times, to think about a national park as a possible model. It has an established organization, it has an executive capacity, it has representation from the local community. I remember when I looked into this before, National Park Authority members are actually tasked to think about the national interest rather than the local interest. And I guess I have in mind a Lego that would be thinking about the best interests of the local area. So that perhaps is a slight tension. National parks have a broad interest in the environment. They don't have responsibility for nature conservation sites or for water quality in their local areas, but they clearly have an interest in those things. They already have national park management plans that could clearly form the basis of perhaps more of a natural capital plan that was focusing on opportunities for nature-based solutions. And as I say, it has executive capability. So National Park seems to have that potential, but as I say, the National Park Authority members perhaps have a national rather than local interest or responsibility or duty, and there may well then be a tension between asking them to be the local Lego as well as being the national park representative. They clearly lack capability in certain areas and clearly lack funding, and of course national parks are not a national, don't cover the whole country, they're only in selected areas. We might, I guess the report on landscapes and the name of the guy who did it now is gone. I mean, extending it to AONBs would extend it to some extent, and that might be one way of extending the reach of these sorts of, or this sort of approach, but they're never going to be national coverage. So the alternative approach seems to me a potential. It might be to go to local authorities, and I haven't talked about that very much. I'm doubtful whether local authorities are the right model in the sense that I don't think they have the capability. Maybe they could develop it. I'm not sure the scale is necessarily right, but it could be counties perhaps might be the right scale. But my sense is that local authorities perhaps are too embedded in a particular element of local governance to be able to operate freely in a way that I think that Legos could operate. So local nature partnerships came out of the Natural Choice White Paper back in 2011, I think, with an aim to establish organizations, a national structure of organizations that drive positive change, contribute to achieving government's national objectives, and become local champions, which is a sort of similar sort of objective to my idea of Legos. If we think we can't do this and we're looking for an organization that has funding capability, then I guess local enterprise partnerships can do this sort of thing, sort of representation. That raises questions because I think not all local enterprise partnerships have been particularly brilliant. But there's something about a model, I think, that suggests that we could do this, and I guess it suggests you could do this without primary legislation, which might be an important point. However, as it stands, local nature partnerships seem to be at very different stages of development. They don't have the executive capability that we're looking for, and of course they lack this core long-term discretionary funding. So then the question is, well, might natural Cambridgeshire act as an emergent Lego? So what do I say about Cambridge? What we normally say about Cambridge is nowadays it has the lowest proportion of rich wildlife and natural greenhouse spaces in the UK. I'm not sure whether that's evidenced, and we are often, people bang on about the lack of trees in Cambridgeshire. Of course, that's because we have fens, and the fens are not the sorts of places where you try and grow forests. But it does have very intensive agriculture. It does have relatively little woodland cover. The fenland is a significant part of Cambridgeshire, and a fairly recent estimate, although the data I think are almost entirely missing, is that peatland in Cambridgeshire contributes or would add 33% to the county's greenhouse gas emissions. So peatland is a lowland peatland in Cambridgeshire is a significant emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. It's also, of course, very productive, a major producer of horticultural products, and therefore a major employer in the local area as well. And then finally, I guess it's subject to very rapid economic population growth. We're seeing new towns. We already have Camborne. We have another new town just north of Cambridge. Cambridge itself is growing, and Peterborough in the north of Cambridge, or to the north, is growing as well. So we have rapid economic population growth impacting on the land. In terms of land use, I'm not sure I want to spend too much, I don't spend any time on at all on this. Substantially arable, intensive farming, very little, I'm afraid, very little green, interesting places to go on walks, really. That's the way it is. What I will perhaps attention to think about a rather crude estimate. I don't have a clear estimate. Maybe DEFRA would know more than I do, about just the amount of agri-environment and agricultural policy money that is being spent in an area like Cambridge. And I'm here looking at Greater Cambridgeshire, so it's greater and it includes Peterborough as well. And that's this sort of crude back of envelope calculation suggests that about £8.5 million, this is in 2019-20, would have been spent on agri-environment policy in the area, and about just something over £50 million being spent on the basic payment scheme in the area, which suggests that there is some room for doing some interesting things at a local scale, even if you don't devolve all of it by any means. So what goes on in Cambridge? I'll focus on two sort of elements of this. Local planning exercises. We seem to have, and again, I'm sure this is going on everywhere, local planning exercises everywhere. So Greater Cambridge Green Infrastructure. Okay. Where did that go? We've had, well, maybe this is an older version. Okay. Oh no, that's where it is. Sorry, I found it. So Cambridgeshire itself has had a green infrastructure plan and sort of identified where habitat might be linked up across the county. More recently, there is a Greater Cambridge Green Infrastructure Opportunity Mapping Project. The local authority, so there's a Greater Cambridge as opposed to Greater Cambridgeshire. So this Greater Cambridge is South Cambridge and Cambridge City. South Cambridge is a sort of donut around the core of central Cambridge, which is slightly odd, but they are now working together to produce their local plan. They've called for green sites in that local area. As I say, parish is producing neighbourhood plans. We'll be looking at habitat and opportunities to enhance habitat and provide public access. We're connected to the Oxcam ARC, which has a natural capital plan, and they're working on environmental elements to that. It's not clear to me which elements of that are still in operation. Much of it might have been dropped, but I think the natural capital plan is still being developed. Water Resources East have been doing a natural capital plan for the east of England, and there is a Food, Farming and Countryside Commission Cambridgeshire Land Use Framework project. What is, I think, significant about nearly all of this stuff is none of it creates a direct incentive on land managers to change the way they operate. So we have endless plans, and I think my concern about the wonderful ambition of the Cambridgeshire Land Use Framework project is that's great, but how do we avoid it just being another plan, another strategy that sits on a desk or at a shelf somewhere? So within the area, for instance, we have the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust Living Landscape Scheme. So we've got lots of people thinking about landscape scale conservation. But again, a sort of question about, well, how do we turn this into direct action on the ground? And then thinking about, I guess, civil society and activity going on to local scale. Just begin, and again, I don't know that Cambridge is different. We've got the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, Futurescapes. We've got a Cambridge Nature Recovery Network. We've got Fens for the Future. We've got the Great Fen Project. We've got Wicken Fen by the National Trust. We've got a proposal for a Fens Biosphere Reserve. We've got Neenscape Landscape Partnership. We've got the Cambridge and Peterborough Future Parks Accelerator. We've got the Land Dyke Countryside Trust. We've got the Cam Ely Ouse Partnership. We've got farmer clusters of various sorts. We've got Angling Water Enterprise Networks in East Anglia. We've got the New Life in the Old West, which is a Cambridgeshire Acre initiative to try and enhance countryside in a local area in the Fens. So all of these, some working with local communities, some working in different ways, some with substantial national funding, some with bits and pieces of local funding, but all largely independent going on. And this is the sort of idea, this is the point about the vibrancy of local community action that is not connected to the central government activities to any significant extent. So Natural Cambridgeshire was set up as a local nature partnership. As far as I can tell, it seemed to sort of sit there and do nothing for several years. But over the last, maybe as much as 10 years, it has become much more active, much more engaged, and doing some interesting things. So its objectives, which perhaps I'll just leave you with, because I'm running out of time, but it has an aim, an objective of doubling nature. Its sort of key slogan has been to double nature in Cambridgeshire, perhaps without anyone knowing quite what doubling nature means, but and if we really don't have very much, then doubling it may well not be enough. But it is ambitious to try and enhance nature in the local area and pursuing a variety of things. It is supported by, I guess you might say, the usual suspects, the local authorities, Natural Cambridgeshire, the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, all the sorts of organisations that will be operating, I guess, in practically every county around the country. What it's done, it has registered itself as a charity to promote nature recovery for the benefit of the public by the preservation, conservation, protection of the environment. It runs quarterly partnership forum events, has up to 80 participants, so there's large numbers of people coming to these things. It's developed a couple of sort of toolkits. The first one was to provide guidance for developers to try and make sure that nature is included in their development plans. It's provided a local nature recovery toolkit for local communities to systematically look at what they can do to enhance nature in their local area. And then it has very recently been given or established a Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Fund for Nature, which I'll say a little bit more in a moment. It's identified landscape priority areas. They're pretty similar. If you look at them, they overlap substantially with the Wildlife Trust areas. They overlap with the areas that the County Council was looking at in terms of its green infrastructure plans. This is just to illustrate some of the stuff that's going on sort of within Natural Cambridgeshire. So this is the Cambridge Past, Present and Future initiative with the Wildlife Trust to think about landscape scale conservation initiatives within the area in and around Cambridge. The fund that has been established, so the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, so we now have a mayor for that area. They have recently awarded 1.3 million to Natural Cambridgeshire. to support their initiative of doubling nature. So £1 million for them to fund projects, and then other money for revenue funding and for maintaining a baseline by the wildlife trusts. What is interesting is that they will provide funding, but they're emphasizing at least match funding and the capacity of these funds to draw in private funds for large-scale projects, particularly within their 6 priority areas. So it's beginning, you can see there the beginnings of, if you like, a strategy for implementing nature recovery within the local area. The sort of challenges I think that faces is it's not clear to me, and I need to spend more time trying to work out where their priority areas came from. I suspect they are things that were going on anyway, and they've sort of put them together and said, well, these are our priority areas, because people had already identified them as their own priority areas, sort of begging the question about whether, if you just started from scratch and try to work out in other ways what the priorities should be, whether you would end up in the same areas. You may well do, but I don't know. Clearly, that implies a need for some sort of systematic assessment. Maybe we just need to look back at all the various plans and strategies that have been going on to synthesize those and to update them, maybe. There's a challenge in terms of needing long-term commitments, or making long-term commitments on the basis of short-term funding, which in finance terms would be a no-no, but it seems to me we're doing it in nature conservation terms. There's an issue that the emphasis is very much on raising private finance, and so it draws us into questions about the capacity for private finance for the provision of nature-based solutions generally, and whether they don't have significant public good characteristics, which really won't be funded through private finance to any significant or substantial or sufficient extent. And really back to the first point, the lack of systematic data on what the potentials may be. So what do I think Natural Cambridgeshire would need to do to develop more as a Lego? Clearly it needs to be transparent, consistent and accountable. Has some of those. I think probably it would need to do more. It needs the systematic assessment of demand that I've mentioned, rather than perhaps the opportunism of responding to existing claims. It would need, therefore, to sit down and perhaps be more explicit about its criteria for identifying priority areas. It needs, I think, reliable core fundings. It is very hard to see what an organisation like this needs to do if it doesn't have that core funding. And balanced stakeholder engagement. It has, as I said, the sort of usual suspects engaging in this. They do seem to be engaging. They seem to be supportive. Maybe that's sufficient. Maybe that's all we need. How do we have confidence that sort of the general public feel that they are engaged in this sort of process, and it's not something dreamed up by local organizations separate from the local community? So then I guess then if that's what we need to think for individual Legos, what do we need at a national scale? We need some sort of structure. So we'd need a framework developed at a national scale to allow and to direct the way in which local nature partnerships could develop. And it may well be that the local nature partnerships are not the best organization to take on this role in particular areas. There may well be initiatives, maybe, as I said, national parks would take over in national parks. AONBs might build the capacity to do it. In other areas, there'll be other organizations maybe associated with catchments. I mean, in some areas, catchment organizations might have the capacity to develop in this sort of ways. There may be a distinction in areas where sort of water is a key determinant of environmental quality, and other areas where actually economic development is a key factor. And you may say, well, the Legos would take slightly different characteristics in those different areas. I think it does need long-term core funding. It's not going to work if Legos are constantly scrapping for project funding. I think this is an earlier version, because I have we did some work before and ended up looking at the issue of projectification, the idea that projects, or we're trying to achieve things through short-term project funding, when actually what we're trying to achieve is long-term objectives, and that's a tension I think that will need to be addressed in funding Legos. That I don't believe that Legos can raise their own funds for the purer public goods, so there probably will need to be tax-based funding of some sort, and that probably will be substantially from central government. Maybe there could be local sort of tax sources too. Continuing funding for national commitments, so national government doesn't opt out from this. There's an element of local demand, but still national commitments for biodiversity, for climate. If we're going to achieve climate change mitigation efficiently, we need to target the areas and the sectors that are best capable of doing that. And that needs to be done to national scale rather than at a local scale. We need much better information about potential. That involves modeling, involves research, it involves case studies. All those sorts of things need to be done to work out what potential there is perhaps for flood mitigation, in particular places, carbon sequestration. There is a real issue I've hinted at in terms of the lowland fens in Cambridgeshire, of really productive farming causing really significant emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. So whether the answer is in polyculture or whether it's in modifying the way we do this or in bits of rewilding, I'm not sure. Maybe we can manage water levels in particular ways. And for all that, we need national oversight, we need guarantee of accountability. So if there's public money going in there, we need to have accountability for the use of that public money. We also need reporting back to the local community so that they understand what is being done with money that is being provided by government for the development of local environments. If all that is tucked away in obscure nature conservation projects to which the public don't have access, then the public won't fund it in political terms. And I fear for the potential for public funding for the rural environment after I think the break at the moment when the government said it will maintain funding through this government or through this parliament. What comes next when that funding stream is competing with education and social care and public health and defence is, I think, a challenge. And if people don't know about the benefits that they're getting from that expenditure, then it's hard to see why they'll put political pressure on government to continue to fund it. So conclusions, I think, simply centralised system, I can't see that it works or can work in the level of detail that we're looking for, or to capture the energy of local initiatives. We need to bring those things together. That, I think, involves some devolution. We have devolution in terms of local plans, but they don't have the capacity to influence on the ground, local land managers on the ground. There's a major role for mediation as a sort of clearinghouse or a brokerage or something to bring the different parties together somehow, to look for opportunities for probably stacking payments for ecosystem services, and then probably matching that with public money as well. So thinking about the sort of direction that local nature recovery, landscape recovery schemes are looking at, but probably at a bigger scale and drawing more across the different sorts of interests. I think arguably a system of Legos has some sort of potential to do much of that, but clearly it needs to be centrally led, it needs core funding, and it needs local support. And that's it. Oh, and then that's the cover of the book. I haven't done anything much since 2016, so I'll bang on with that. And some pictures from something that we've done a little while ago, but more recently. Trying to get at the idea of moving from intensive farming at the top to multifunctional farming at the bottom. But that's it anyway, so I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So I think we have a few minutes for discussion, so I'll hand over to Julie to facilitate the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Ian. That was fascinating and certainly resonates with some work we're doing with perennial biomass crops. But that's another story. I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. There's nothing in the chat at the moment, so you can raise your hand or pop a question in the chat. I don't think anyone's going to be particularly shy because that was such an interesting talk. Janet, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Really interesting as usual. I come back to this issue about whether we need organisations to sit alongside local government, or whether we actually ought to be saying these things ought to be part of a local government responsibility, because of some of the issues that you raised about accountability and transparency, and really being seen to be in the best interests of the public at large. Because it seems to me that a lot of what you described, you know, is already happening in Gloucestershire. The local nature partnership is already taking this role, or at least the local nature partnership, along with a load of other local actors, including Frag South West and the local rural community council, and a whole load of other people that are working together on this kind of whole agenda. But there is a question there, I think, about accountability and about, you know, who are the constituents for this, and how do they get involved, and how does one ensure legitimacy, particularly if you're then talking about persuading DEFRA that Elm ought to be going through this kind of route, or a significant part of Elm ought to be going through this route, which is really something that I think myself and Chris, who's here also, would feel quite strongly about, you know, because of all those things you said about the difficulty of any central system really picking up on both local opportunities and local skills and knowledge and understanding of culture to produce robust results. So I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, maybe we discount local government at our peril in this. I mean, they've been shrunk, you know, by decades of inadequate government funding, and they you know, their remit now is a much narrower one, perhaps, than it was a few decades ago. Maybe you could think a bit about that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I guess I come back to it, talking to somebody the other day, and they said, yes, but of course the planning system needs to be linked into this. And my response to that was that at the moment anyway, the planning system doesn't deal with this, and it's not set up to deal with this, that we've substantially left rural land out of the planning system. And I guess arguably that's a decision we took in the 1980s. But I think, I mean, maybe, I guess that's not irreversible. I think I worry a bit. I worry about the capability of local government that has been simply sort of shedding powers. It's being cut back in terms of funding. It's been putting stuff out to consultants and so on, rather than doing this in hand. I also worry about, perhaps I worry about people worrying about local authorities, that certain sectors, certain parts of the community perhaps don't have confidence in local authorities to do stuff and to get stuff done. That local authorities maybe, if you give it to local authorities, it gets tangled up with local politics and local bureaucracy that might hold it back, in a way that I think something like a Lego could be free of that sort of local bureaucracy, the sort of nitty-gritty of local councils, that I fear would put off perhaps private commercial organizations, farm bodies, and so on. There is, I don't know the answer. My gut is to sort of, at the moment, to sort of pursue the idea of Legos as being something distinct, and to see whether that gets anywhere. It probably won't, but it seems interesting to look at.
Thank you. Another question, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was fascinating. So my simple question is that there seems to be just a reluctance to fund governance. So, and how do we make the case for that? So two of the examples you mentioned, local nature partnerships are run on a shoestring, catchment, the catchment-based approach, the partnerships. They're something like £12,000 a year to try and run those partnerships, and you sneak out your funding from whatever source you can. As a result, some of them, like Gloucestershire, works really well for the NMP and our catchment partnerships, others not. So that, there's no clear winner in that sense. And of course, sometimes as you said, natural area works better than the administrative area. But I guess it's that point. If we want integrated local governance, somehow it needs to be paid for. We need to, some of the data on biodiversity is shocking, and so we don't really have a basis on which to make decisions. And then, if you need to take time to build trust, collaboration between all those different partners in the way that you've highlighted. And I just think that's a major stumbling block. I've always struggled. Yeah. So do you have what? And of course, there is no silver bullet here, as
yes.
we know.
Yes,
But
yes. Absolutely. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, there's a lot going on at the moment that maybe provides elements of an argument. I mean, clearly it's a matter of making an argument. It's a political argument, and it's a matter of getting public support that will be sufficient to persuade politicians to vote for money for these sorts of things. And clearly the impediments are the enormous competitors competing for funding. Maybe also the Treasury. I mean, I'm never quite sure to what extent we can blame the Treasury. I'm always slightly worried in DEFRA when they say, well, we have to make a case for this. Let's do a cost-benefit analysis. And that we need to show a sort of positive benefit cost ratio, otherwise the Treasury won't pay any attention. It bothers me because I'm not sure that I believe the valuations, although actually people who do valuations are pretty good at getting high numbers. So maybe that's one route. There is, I think, popular support, whether that is yet sort of articulated sufficiently to persuade politicians to allocate money for these sorts of things, I'm not sure. I mean, the health argument that perhaps I was slightly uncharitable about needing to mention health everywhere, and it's one of those fashions that we didn't used to mention it at all, and now we mention it everywhere. And again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It clearly is important, and that we need to build on that sort of case. I still feel a bit disappointed with the Dasgupta report, and perhaps it's presumptuous of me to be disappointed with Dasgupta, and it no doubt was in many places very erudite and sophisticated analysis in all sorts of ways, but it seemed to me it stopped too soon. I mean, it didn't do the bit at the end that provides a story or a document to take to the Treasury, and they commissioned it, so that's where it started, to go back to the Treasury and say, how do we do assessment of nature conservation in the light of what is included in the Dasgupta report? I mean, it was set up with the idea that this was a sort of biodiversity version of the Stern report on climate change. And Stern provided some very clear guidelines and tools for doing economic evaluation of climate change. So something as clear as sort of saying, well, we apply a lower discount rate, or we treat risk in a particular way to recognize the small probability of a very extreme risk, and that this justifies investment even if in sort of expected prices, expected terms, it doesn't quite work in the same way. Dasgupta didn't do that. And again, I was talking to somebody else the other day who has the potential perhaps to make this happen, to say, well, actually, there is a piece of work following from Dasgupta missing, because nobody much in the Treasury seems to know about the Dasgupta report, or certainly to see any evidence of it. And actually, if you read the end of the chapter of the Dasgupta report, and I think I didn't read all of it, and there are bits of it, it just goes into Greek and loses me. If you read the end, it sort of peters away into, well, we should do a bit more education, and sort of implies that we should do economic valuation. And yet a big chunk of the report seems to me, unpinning economic valuation, sort of in terms of the sort of moral issues, the limits of sort of neoclassical economics, the uncertainty, the ignorance, all these other sorts of things are all in the report and sort of set out through the report. And then at the end it says, well, we'll go and do an economic valuation, which seems to me not, it seems to me that the report argues against that, but then that doesn't provide anything else. So perhaps doing more with Dasgupta might be a lever somehow into the Treasury to say, look, you need to recognize the fundamental importance of these things, and that somehow needs to feed into decision making and the recommendations that the Treasury makes for spending. But that's a ramble around, Chris, to say that I really don't know the answer to your question. But it's really, it's a fundamental question.
Damien, I think you might have to be the last one because we're
okay. I'll make it quick.
1:15. No, that's fine.
Thanks, Ian. That was a really interesting seminar. I was just wondering a little bit about the idea that you could have almost like we do have to some extent kind of an element of sort of conflict or competing interests, or and I'm just thinking about this. I do really like this idea of a kind of Lego type infrastructure to coordinate things. But people have their own little patches of territory, their own things that they're doing. And I'm just thinking about the process of how one might determine what, so rather than create a new institution, you've suggested it might be, I can't remember what it's called again, Natural Cambridgeshire in this case, but how one might go about sort of determining who might be the institution or the infrastructure that is the Lego, and how that might be negotiated, if do you know what I mean? So
yeah, no,
that sort of process of getting to that point, because I really do agree with what you're saying in terms of needing a greater coordination. We did some work in Cumbria and there's all this stuff going on, you know, and it's great, but it's kind of a bit messy and a bit overlapping and duplicated, etc.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, how one might go about getting to that point, or have you had, you know, people say these things?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, very good question. I don't know the answer. I think two sorts of responses. One, I guess, and it's an interesting question, and maybe it's something I've put to people in Cambridgeshire and say, I mean, so the question would be, would the organisations that are showing their support for Cambridgeshire, which would include local authorities and others, would they put their hand up and say, yes, we think the Natural Cambridgeshire should be something like a Lego? So to ask and to see whether we can get some agreement. And my guess is you would get different answers. I mean, I wonder whether, I can't remember why now, it's a while ago, but looking at things going on in Cumbria or certainly in the northwest and maybe the Lake District, the sort of water, in the Eden Valley, for instance, I think it was, and there's sort of a sort of catchment organisations which are more developed, perhaps capturing the whole catchment rather than just, because clearly one structure for this sort of thing would be catchment based. That in sort of our area, we might have I think it was on the list, the Cam Ely Ouse catchment partnership. But I don't know that it does much other than have meetings and talk to each other. So it may well be that different, and that was my sense of at one stage thinking, well, maybe in a sort of less developed area like the Lake District, maybe it's not going to be something like a sort of a more urban-based Lego. It's going to be something more like a catchment partnership. Maybe in an urban area, maybe it is a local authority just because of the importance of planning. But the question is whether you can get some sort of answer. If government said, okay, let's think about how we put these things together, and invite local areas to tender or to promote something in their own area. Maybe that's a way of doing it. The other point that I thought you were going to make, and you don't think you did quite, but it's really important, and I think you implied it, is there will be competition between local interests for funding, for priority areas, for all those things. And I've sort of skated over that in a sort of fashionable way, I think, actually. I think we increasingly get together and say, well, we don't believe in cost benefit analysis. What are we going to do? Well, we'll get together and talk to and find a solution. And clearly the world isn't like that. And when I talk about national parks, clearly many people would sort of hate the idea of a national park having this sort of role, because they don't like their local national park for various reasons. So what I think that I can't answer that question, but it seems to me it draws us towards the idea that whatever we do, it needs to be a substantial enough organization that it has the authority to command agreement, even when certain people outside are saying, don't like this, I want more money, I'm complaining, I don't like what you're doing. It needs to be able to withstand that sort of criticism. So we need a sufficiently robust organization that can withstand criticism too.
Right. Excellent. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ian. I'm sure there's lots more to talk about, but we'll have to conclude it there. I don't know if you can see the chat. There are a few comments in there for you to digest and take home.
Have a look.
The homework from
Certainly,
Janet. But on behalf of everyone at CCRI, we'd like to thank you very much for your contribution. So the virtual class.
It's a virtual class. We live in a strange world. Thank you. No, thank you all very much. Thank you for the questions. There's some nice things for me to think about. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for not having to leave my house, I guess. So great. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you in person in various ways in the future.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Thanks, Ian.
Bye.
Take care.